Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving into a deep analysis of the situation in Iran today, but we're deliberately moving away from the daily headlines.
Right.
You, our listener, are probably familiar with the broad strokes. The country's facing a severe economic crisis. You see these localized protests flaring up. Security forces intervene.
And the system just seems caught in this cycle of renewed but, seemingly contained dissent.
Exactly. And when most organizations cover this, they're always asking these linear questions.
Yeah, questions designed to predict an outcome. Will the protests succeed? Will there be a revolution? Or will the regime manage to suppress it all and, restore stability?
And those are necessary questions for immediate reporting, I get that. But they're really just after-the-fact evaluations.
They are. And our sources suggest that if you focus only on those outcomes, you actually miss the real fundamental shift that's happening just beneath the surface.
So today, we need to ask a different, much deeper question. What boundary was crossed in the relationship between the Iranian state and its society that just cannot be uncrossed, regardless of what happens next week?
We are not here to predict failure or success, and we're definitely not taking a side. Our mission is purely analytical. We want to understand the irreversible, nonlinear structural change.
The moment it all became visible.
The precise moment when the state's interference became visibly undeniable. We're looking at the changing cognitive conditions, not trying to guess the final result.
So to establish our base camp, let's start with the hard, linear facts. What's the observable chain of events here? What sets the stage?
Well, if you look at the raw sequence, the ignition point it's fundamentally economic. We're talking about currency decline and this widespread, really punishing inflation.
So just getting the things you need every day has become a struggle.
A huge struggle. And it's expanded across multiple regions. So this intense economic pressure, that's the baseline reality for millions of Iranians.
And that's what sparks the first protests.
That's correct. It starts with these small-scale, very localized protests, really driven by that deep economic discontent. From there, the observed pattern is a pretty strict sequence.
Okay.
The security forces, so that's the police, the Revolutionary Guard, the Basi militia, that whole network, they intervene. This leads to clashes, and crucially, we have reliable reports confirming the use of live ammunition.
Which brings us to the most painful inflection point in that sequence, the deaths.
Yes, the deaths are reported, and this activates a crucial second layer, the funerals.
Right.
Funerals in Iran, because of religious and social tradition, they're kind of protected spaces. They're very difficult for the state to just completely suppress.
Not without risking a massive backlash.
A massive backlash, and they attract huge crowds, often from communities that maybe weren't even part of the initial economic protests.
So the funeral itself becomes this socially, almost religiously sanctioned space that the state can't just shut down. And the sources show that these funerals aren't the end of the event.
No, they're the catalyst.
They're the catalyst for the next step.
Absolutely. The grief, the gathering, it all attracts renewed protests that break out right at or around these burial sites. So you get this cycle: protest, intervention, death, funeral, and then re-protest.
And this is happening in parallel across multiple cities.
In parallel, right. And it steadily expands the layers of who's participating. It goes from just economic actors to broader social layers, university students, commercial districts, and so on.
And at the same time, you have the international dynamics getting woven into this.
Right. You have government officials who publicly acknowledge some of the discontent, but they don't really offer concrete solutions for the economic problems.
Meanwhile, videos of the protests, the suppression, are being shared globally.
In real time. Then U.S. political leaders comment on it, which the Iranian government immediately calls out as, internal interference.
So all of this is the observed sequence. It tells us what happened.
It tells us what happened, but it doesn't explain why. Why the fundamental rules of engagement changed this time.
Let's shift our lens then, because protests driven by economic pressure, they happen often. So why did this specific chain of events, right now, break the mold? It suggests the structural defense mechanisms, which have been so robust for decades, just failed.
That is the core nonlinear insight. The state in Iran was, historically, designed to manage and hide popular pressure before it could unify into a single, visible thing the state had to publicly confront.
So discontent was always there.
Always present. But the government controlled the conditions for visibility itself.
And that stability, that sort of implicit control, it rested on three structural pillars. Let's clarify those for the listener.
Okay, so the first pillar was what the sources call a low expectation society. Because of decades of sanctions and internal economic problems, survival became the baseline, not, prosperity.
Which creates a strange kind of psychological stability.
It does. People manage their frustration by just accepting that this is how things are. They prioritize weathering the storm over demanding a big change that might bring chaos.
So the very pain caused by sanctions inadvertently gave the state a kind of psychological shield.
Precisely. The second pillar was the status quo bias. You look around the region, you see instability, war in neighboring states.
And maintaining the flawed order, seems necessary.
Exactly. If the choice is between the current system, however bad it is, and potential civil war, the bias is always toward the status quo.
And the third pillar is the mechanism that actively enforced that silence.
That would be the robust control systems. Our sources call it the Security Operating System, or OS.
And when we say OS, what are we talking about?
We're talking about that coordinated network, the Revolutionary Guard, intelligence, the morality police, the besiege. This whole system, which is backed by a religious narrative, it functioned like a powerful, localized immune response. It guaranteed the immediate recovery of dissent.
So the system was never about making frustration disappear. It was about making sure that frustration stayed divided, localized, and silenced before it could stand up as a unified, visible force.
Yes. Control was exercised over the very act of seeing the interference.
That interference was implicit, hidden.
Contained. Until it wasn't.
The breakdown, then. It wasn't a sudden political declaration or some emotional spasm. It was the synchronized collapse of these underlying conditions for visibility. Let's dig into those three collapse conditions, because this seems to be the heart of the irreversible change.
The first, and I think the most critical, was a qualitative change in life pressure. The system was designed to manage chronic suffering. Chronic means, I suffer, but I adapt, I endure.
Right.
This pressure shifted to an acute state. The sources describe it as the emergence of an uncontrollable point within daily life.
Can you ground that for us?
Yeah.
What does that shift from chronic suffering to acute inability actually look like for a person?
It's the shift from I'm struggling to afford bread, which is chronic and painful but familiar, to I cannot do today what I could reliably do yesterday. It's an immediate, concrete inability. Maybe yesterday they could find essential medicine for a family member. Today, that shelf is empty. Or the currency has devalued so much overnight that the price is just genuinely impossible.
So the chronic suffering of inflation, which the state could always blame on external enemies,
Suddenly transforms into the acute, immediate failure of the state to manage the very basics of life. That distinction is profound.
because the security OS can suppress a political banner, but it can't repress an empty medicine cabinet.
Precisely. That's the non-linear pressure rising. It's a point of failure rooted in survival itself, which the linear control mechanism, the police, they just can't address.
And the second collapse follows from that.
Immediately, the legitimacy narrative breakdown, the cost-benefit analysis of the government story just failed.
It failed completely.
The official narrative that they're protecting the nation from external threats, it was still active, but the cost of governance began to visibly exceed its benefits. The more officials spoke about stability, the wider the gap grew between their words and people's acute lived experience.
So the narrative itself became counterproductive.
It started burning through their remaining political capital, and fast. And the third factor brings us back to that linear event, the funeral cycle, what our sources call the inversion of symbolic devices.
This is a critical point of failure.
Absolutely. Funerals are not just gatherings, they are sacred spaces, religiously protected. They are moralized moments where the state is expected to show respect, or at the very least, restraint.
So when repression, especially lethal force, happens in that symbolic space,
The state isn't just applying force, it's violating a moral contract. It's not just suppressing a riot, it's attacking a protected social function.
right,
And when that sanctity is broken, legitimacy is inverted. It stops being an inherent status the state has, and it becomes a public question that every person is forced to answer. Did the government have the right to violate this space? And that question, once it's raised publicly and violently, you can't easily suppress it again.
Okay, so let's focus now on the ultimate consequence of this triple collapse. What does visible interference fundamentally mean for that state-society relationship?
It's the essential structural shift. Before, the relationship operated under this implicit contract. The people maintain silence, the government claims it's providing governance, and the mechanism of intervention remains implicit. invisible.
And that system has now been irrevocably exposed.
Yes. The new condition is that action and suppression are now observed simultaneously. The system can no longer operate in the dark. The whole operational machine, the security OS, its commanders, its methods, it's all exposed to public scrutiny. And that fundamentally changes the nature of authority.
It changes from being based on a moral right to being based on pure visible force.
Exactly. And if the mechanism of control is visible, that means every citizen's posture changes too.
Silence is no longer passive.
That is the profound cognitive shift. Silence is no longer neutral. It's instantly recognized as a specific, observed posture in a visible, undeniable conflict. If you're not protesting, you are now perceived as actively choosing compliance in a conflict you are being faced to see.
There's no passive escape anymore.
None. And the government's attempts to manage the crisis have also become visible. The relationship itself has, as the sources say, phenomenalized.
Meaning it's become a public phenomenon.
A publicly visible, undeniable phenomena of conflict management. Governance isn't an abstract promise anymore. It's an observed act. The public sees the machine, and they know the purpose of that machine is to reestablish the very silence they now recognize as political suppression.
So if the integrity of the whole system relied on the invisibility of its control mechanisms, what does this new state of visibility mean for the state's ability to govern long-term?
Linear control, fear, division, localization, it's powerful, but its effectiveness degrades very quickly when it's exposed to nonlinear pressure.
And that nonlinear pressure comes from the core elements of life.
Sustenance, death, the forced choice of silence. The irreversible boundary was crossed when, even for a moment, the equation proved true. Nonlinear pressured linear control.
And if that threshold is crossed, even if it's just for a moment in one neighborhood, a complete structural rollback is impossible. You can't unsee it.
You cannot. The system can never return to the state where interference was implicit and contained. The available pathways forward are now limited, but they all share this new condition of chronic visibility.
So the system can try for what the sources call re-silencing.
Right, for short-term stability. Or it can enter a state of chronic visibility, which means this midterm attrition of its own governing capacity.
The sources outline 3 possible scenarios moving forward, but they're all based on this new reality, this visible reality.
That's right. The first path is re-silencing, where physical order gets restored. But the crucial caveat is that the implicit premise of stability, it doesn't return. The silence is now forced, and it's brittle.
Okay. And the second path?
The second, which is seen as more likely in the midterm, is chronic visibility. So you get this oscillation between small-scale protests and forced silence, which leads to the sustained, gradual wearing away of governing costs. It just makes the regime more expensive to run day by day.
And the highest impact but lowest probability path
Is structural transformation, where the governing premise itself is redefined. But, regardless of which path is taken, the crucial insight is the same.
The cognitive conditions can't revert.
The conditions for cognitive engagement and for interference visibility cannot go back to the way they were. The public has seen the machine.
So Iran, a state that was actually highly resilient against exposing its internal life pressure, it serves as a powerful, almost global example here.
It really does. This process of visible interference, it's not isolated. The fact that these implicit structures broke down in a system specifically designed to tolerate and internalize that pressure, it suggests that similar visibility conditions are emerging across the global membrane.
So this isn't just relevant for sanctioned states or authoritarian regimes.
No, it hints that even in the silent layers of developed countries, where governance mechanisms often operate invisibly, the conditions for acute, visible interference are shifting.
Which means, even if the streets quiet down tomorrow, something fundamental about that state-society contract has already changed.
The change wasn't the start of a transformation. It's the reality that the world is entering a relationship where pretending not to see is no longer possible. The operating condition of visibility has been permanently updated.